Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Anthony Rodriguez, and I am the section manager of the zoning section of the Department of Community Development. And what I'm going to do when the PowerPoint comes up is I'm just going to walk you briefly through the Pine Island specific provisions of a larger package of land development code amendments that we have presented to the Board of County Commissioners. The board directed our staff to do some public outreach efforts back in June. This is part of a series of meetings that we are currently conducting over the summer, and the intent is to bring these amendments back to the Board of County Commissioners for consideration for adoption on September 5th. If you could advance the slideshow, please. Thank you. So I wanted to start off just providing a little bit of context in terms of what the existing regulations are on Pine Island. And this is an excerpt from our Land Development Code, section 33-1087, which is specific to the greater Pine Island Community Plan area. And what this language specifies essentially is that no building or structure may be erected or altered so that the peak of the roof exceeds 38 feet above the average grade of the lot in question or 45 feet above mean sea level, and the lower of those two provisions are the provisions that govern. There are some additional provisions in letters A through E that are related to the exemption of minimum required flood elevation in exchange for the average grade of the lot in question. There are some provisions that prevent exceedances in height in exchange for increased setbacks, which is a current provision in our code elsewhere that you can take advantage of in unincorporated Lee County. There are some specifications on how to measure structures, in particular relative to structures without roofs and how we measure that to the maximum highest point of the structure. These provisions also specify that no deviations or variances can be granted from the height requirements established in the Land Development Code specific to Pine Island through the plan development process, and that any variance from the height restrictions that's pursued through the Land Development Code requires an extra finding by the hearing examiner who presides over those variance cases that the variance that would be approved would actually benefit the general public and not just the property owner in question. Next slide, please. So the proposed regulations are part of a larger reorganization of height-related land development code provisions into an existing section of the Land Development Code in Chapter 34, which is the general zoning section. And what we've done is we've taken the amendments or the existing language and we've proposed to move it to Chapter 34. In addition, we are providing for a uniform way to measure building height throughout Lee County. Depending upon where you are in Lee County, how our staff measures building height can differ. Captiva has one specific set of regulations, Pine Island has another, San Carlos Island has another, and then the rest of unincorporated Lee County has other regulations. And so it becomes a little bit difficult for staff to administer, creates a little bit of uncertainty in terms of new property owners and developers looking for which regulations apply to them. It's not the easiest thing to decipher. So in order to address that issue, staff is consolidating all of the building height related provisions of the Land Development Code into this one existing section. In addition to doing that, because we are measuring building height from the lowest point from where a building permit can be issued, which differs depending if you're outside of a flood hazard area, you're inside of a flood hazard area, you're in a velocity zone or a coastal A zone, we're taking the measurement from the lowest point from where a building permit can be issued. And we're measuring it up to the midpoint of a roof that has a pitched roof, to the highest point of a roof that has a flat roof, and there are some other provisions in terms of other specific roof types of how we would measure that building height too. In order to compensate for the fact that Pine Island's existing regulations don't speak to base flood elevation, and they in fact specifically exempt it, what we've done is we've taken that 38-foot building height as measured from grade to the peak of the roof, and we've lowered that number to 33 feet from base flood to the midpoint of the roof, to kind of offset some of the height-related concerns that may be presented as part of these changes. Next slide, please. It's probably pretty difficult to see, but these are some renderings that they're on the county website. And what it essentially illustrates is the top elevation shows the existing regulations and how those are put into practice. And it's really difficult to read, so I apologize. But essentially, the dimensions on the left-hand side of those drawings specify 45 feet from sea level or 38 feet from the average grade of the lot to the peak of the roof, which is consistent with what existing regulations require. And the proposed drawings at the bottom, and I see that the roofs look cut off, but there are pitched roofs on top of these drawings. And what they essentially illustrate is how county staff would measure height if these amendments were adopted. And specifically, I just want to point out that there are colored boxes at the bottom of each drawing, and those correspond to your flood hazard area maps, your flood insurance rate maps that are adopted by FEMA and that were last amended in November of last year. Next slide, please. In addition to the Pine Island regulations, we also have regulations that regulate specific properties known as the Matlacha Residential Overlay. This is a particular graphic from the Land Development Code, and the building height provisions in the Matlacha Residential Overlay specify that the maximum height of a building may not exceed 32 feet as measured from design flood elevation to the peak of the roof. And next slide, please. And these regulations are proposed to be amended because we are talking about providing for a consistent method of measuring height. Relative to pitched roofs, we're proposing to measure that to the midpoint of the roof. And so essentially what we've done is we've changed the maximum building height of the building may not exceed 32 feet as measured in accordance with the proposed language for measuring height to the midpoint of the roof. Next slide. And again, these are properties within, or these are mock-ups relative to the Matlacha Residential Overlay that illustrate how building height is currently measured and how it is proposed to be measured if these amendments are adopted. That's the last slide that I have. I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. I also have some other staff with me. If I can't answer those questions, we can certainly find the right person to answer those questions. And thanks for your time tonight. Thanks for being here.
If anybody has a question, if you would please come forward to the microphone. That way everybody that's on Facebook that are watching it now and later will be able to hear the questions. Does anybody have any questions they would like answered? Can we get that website?
All right, and then my question is, how does the Matlacha height affect the historic homes? If your house was contributing historic and is still there, do we have to raise, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a good question. The Matlacha Residential Overlay is a separate area from the historic district. So the provisions of the Matlacha Residential Overlay do not apply to the historic district. Relative to the website where you can access a summary of the Land Development Code amendments and a copy of the proposed ordinance, it's legov.com/DCD, and we will provide this to you so you don't have to write it down. Well, you're writing it down. I'll give it to you anyway. /DCD, and then I think it's building height amendments, all one word.
I believe on our agenda in the lobby area actually has it written on there also. You could take a picture of it with your phone.
We can also provide an email link for distribution as well.
Can you say that one more time, please?
Sure. It's legov.com/DCD. DCD, yep. D is in dog, C is in cat, D is in dog. /height amendments.
It's also posted on our website. I think I've already gone there. Thank you.
Hi, Noel Andrus. I don't have any disagreement with wanting to streamline the system. Don't have any disagreement with what you put in section or chapter 34. But at the time, I was serving on the local planning agency, and we had a very large crowd of people from Pine Island that were very concerned about height. Height is extremely important out here. And I think for you to just throw out everything in section 33, 1087, without including anything specifically, like provision D absolutely needs to be in chapter 34. There has to be notice put on record that there's not going to be any deviations from these height restrictions, or else we're going to have everybody and his brother coming in here. We already had one right over here behind Publix, where they wanted to make their storage buildings higher, and it was granted already a deviation for a variance in height structure. So I don't think you can eliminate all of these, and I'd like to ask you to go back and look at these, because they're not anything to do with measurement. They're to do with policy. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Just to clarify, I wanted to place on the record that we've relocated this language to chapter 34. We have not changed the deviation or variance prohibition. Correct. That's correct. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I can repeat it if you don't want to get up.
My question is about setbacks that increase when the height of a building goes higher.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that is in place for Pine Island?
No.
Why?
It's specifically prohibited in section 33-1087 that we have a code provision, and basically what that code provision says is if you want to go higher than the maximum height in a zoning district, you can do that, but you must provide a setback of an additional 6 inches for every foot that you exceed your zoning district height maximum.
That's in place for Pine Island?
That's in place for all of Lee County. However, in Pine Island's regulations, you're specifically prohibited from utilizing that.
Why?
That's just the way the code was written at the
So
time.
you can
I was
have
not part of it
You
at
can
the time.
have a very high building on a very small lot.
You would be subject to the maximum height of the zoning district, the maximum height in Pine Island, which would be 38 feet above the grade of the lot.
Okay.
I just want clarification, if I could, please.
Yes, sir?
From what you just said previously, that it sounds like you're saying that the height restrictions that we've had for Pine Island aren't being changed in any significant way. They're just being moved. And it's not really going to affect us out here. Is that correct, or am I misinterpreting?
That's correct.
what I said?
That is correct.
The other question is then why move it?
The reason we're moving the height regulations that pertain to specific community areas in the county is because it's an ease of administration situation for staff, and it's a certainty situation for members of the public who are not necessarily familiar with our code. So our effort in order to make things a little bit easier for everybody is to move all of those provisions into one code section. And I will tell you, sir, that one of the themes that we have been hearing is why is everything being moved to one section? Why are we taking it out of our community-specific regulations and moving it into a regulation that applies to all of Lee County? So we will note that comment, and when this comes back for consideration before the Board of County Commissioners, what we're going to do is we're going to summarize these comments, and we're going to ask the board whether or not they would like us to pursue some changes or draft some changes at that time.
Once it's moved over to the Lee County area, what protects that to stay that same height restriction in the future? What happens after we have this meeting here today and we all agree upon it, that then 5-10 years from now, that then it's moved into Lee County and this meeting's all forgotten about, that then someday, that then those new people say, oh, well, we want to change those height restrictions. We want to go to 3-4 stories or whatever. What protects us out here then in the future?
That's a good question. Our legislative process protects that exact thing from happening. That really can't happen without any public hearings and proper notice. The expectation would be that in the future, if that were to ever happen, we would come back out here and we would present that to the communities at that time. One of the things we are doing, even though we are relocating this language from Chapter 33 to Chapter 34, there will still be a cross-reference in Chapter 33 that specifies, if you're wondering about building height regulations, here's where you go to find that information. Yes, ma'am?
Hearing examiner, is that county official or you're being incorporated official?
The hearing examiner is a board-appointed, I believe, judge, for lack of a better term. That office hears our public hearing zoning cases, special exceptions, variances, and she acts as a decider in certain cases, and she acts as a recommender in other cases. So it's a board-appointed position.
At the county level?
Yes, ma'am.
Does anybody else have a question? Otherwise, I do. Okay. So my question is, when it comes to 34-2174, you're actually removing number C altogether. And the C says the height increase described in section 43-2174A and B may not be used in the greater Pine Island area. But you're stating that it's all going to be incorporated into the newer sections in 34, but yet you are erasing that one little bit that gives us the extra protection. Why is that?
Can you run that by me one more time? So I
That's
have my
fine.
cheat sheet now.
It's section 34-2174. In one of the amendments that was sent in, I think it was in June 20th or June 30th?
Yes.
Or that section C was completely removed and expect to be, that you're asking for it to be taken out. And that's an extra protection layer that we had for height here on the island and the setbacks, because we're trying to keep it from going to the hearing examiners, because unfortunately, what I have seen a lot, and it's not every time, that it's being approved by the county, it goes to the examiner, even though they come to us and do their presentation. Basically, all they're getting is a verbal tongue lashing, because it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, it doesn't give any weight to the residents, and then the examiner reviews it. If it's all within legal bounds, you guys approve it. But without this little section, that's going to put us more vulnerable.
I understand. So that section you're referencing, 34-2174C, is actually a redundancy that's being removed. So if you go to section 34-2175,
Yes.
A5, which is specific to Greater Pine Island, subsection A specifies that you can not take advantage of that.
It only states here that the provision of that section 24-2175A does not apply to Greater Pine Island, but it doesn't talk about B.
Subsection A that's being referenced in that particular section, I'll read it. I just want to read it to you, and I'll read it to everyone so they can understand.
Understood.
It says, subject to conditions set forth in section 34-2175, which is the section we're talking about, the next section, any building or structure may be permitted to exceed the height limitations specified by the zoning district regulations in which the property is located, provided every street, side, water body, and rear setback is increased by 1/2 foot for every 1 foot by which the building or structure exceeds the specified height limitation. So the provision, this particular provision essentially says, if you want to exceed your height in your zoning district, you can do that in exchange for increased setbacks. But that does not apply to Pine Island, correct?
Okay, and then B, that says in zone districts that do not specify a height limit, a maximum height limit, an increased setback is stated. Because we're being lumped into the larger part of the codes, Pine Island's restrictions are getting, in a sense, released into larger codes, so that how are we going to keep B from being applied to Pine Island if it is not specifically stated it cannot be?
What B is essentially saying is if you have a zoning district that doesn't have a maximum height assigned, which off the top of my head, I can't think of a conventional zoning district where we don't have a maximum height.
Currently.
The maximum height typically is always 35 feet. Then, if there is no maximum height assigned, then that height is 35 feet. But
And-
that would not necessarily apply, I would say, in probably 99.5% of cases.
There's always seems to be that squeaky point, whatever, that'll come
The
through.
0.5%.
So the redundancy that was on there was put there for a reason, and I don't see a real reason why to remove it other than to clean up the view of the codes.
That's correct. I mean, our goal when we do these exercises, not just for this particular set of amendments, but for every set of changes that we propose and the board votes on, our goal is to eliminate redundancies, because over time, language changes, it becomes different in one section but not another, and then it creates conflict when it comes to time to actually administer those sections of the code, and you have to weigh one provision against the other, where at one point maybe it said the same thing, but now it says something different, and so how do you reconcile that as a staff person? So that's why we're proposing.
That's
to
because
change
your book's this big now.
Yes, we're trying to make it one page less, just one.
So I thank you for discussing that with me, but I certainly hope you'll reevaluate that and see that a redundancy isn't such a bad idea.
We will certainly take a look to make sure that what we are trying to protect as it relates to Pine Island is still protected.
Thank you.
I've got a question from one of our Facebook viewers. Greg says, looking at the drawings, it appears that the height regulations will be measured from the buildable level over the floodplain. Is the measurement to middle roof still going to be from grade, or is that from the elevated height? Is the new zoning allowing a 12-foot stilt home to add the 33 feet to 12, or has that always been the case?
That's been the case in most of Lee County. Most of Lee County speaks to measuring height from some iteration of base flood elevation or whatever the building code requires in order for you to obtain a permit.
Right.
The language, like I was referencing in the conversation just before with Deborah, depending on where it is a little bit different. And so what we're trying to do is to standardize that. And the way we're standardizing that is we're starting our measurement from the lowest point where you can obtain a building permit, which in the case of a property in a flood hazard area, depending on how high that flood hazard area is and how high a building needs to be off the ground, we would start that measurement from the lowest point where you could actually obtain a building permit.
So let's say we're in flood zone elevation A. So I don't know what the base elevation would be there. Is that 5 feet?
But let's say for hypothetical, and the drawings, if you look at the drawings on the website, and you can't really see them here, but we relied on a base flood elevation of 7.
Okay.
So let's say the grade of your lot is 2 feet above sea level, your base flood elevation is 7. That means that your building permit would not be able to be issued until your finished floor was at 8. You have to be 1 foot above your base flood elevation. We would start the measurement of 33 feet from elevation 8 up 33 feet to the midpoint of the roof.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Base flood elevation.
Okay, and then I have another question. In the practical application of measuring the lowest inhabitable floor elevation is based on topography, I assume, of the area, or by the submitting of the building plans. And for instance, the floodplain is 4, but the builder wants to raise the lot, does not want to raise the lot, and decides to make a first level like carport or storage uninhabitable. And so their first habitation is on the 8th foot. Where do you pull the permit from? Because your permit says may, and may is a very weak word legally.
So when we say may, we mean if you can get let's use your example. If your average grade of your lot is at 2 feet above sea level, and your base flood elevation's at 4. And you decide, you know what, that's too low, I want to go a little bit higher. We would start your measurement at 4 because that's where you could legally obtain a building permit. So you're 33 feet from, you would essentially be self-penalizing yourself by going a little bit higher, because the goal is to allow people to have the same vertical volume of their building if it was on the ground out of a flood zone versus if you were in a flood zone.
So that is written in somewhere that this is what base level is, and doesn't matter which way you and the future yous will interpret it the same way. Do you have a guiding document for that, or you?
We don't necessarily have a guiding document. That may be something that if these amendments are adopted, that it would probably be, would happen after those amendments were adopted. We would provide some public outreach information to explain, kind of in simple language, how we would apply these regulations moving forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else have a question? We have a gentleman.
My question is basically when you're talking about the base level, are you referring to any agency that's using that definition, such as the Army Corps or anybody else, be it on a state or federal level?
Yeah, so the intent of the regulation is when we say the lowest point from which a building permit may be issued, that elevation may be set by FEMA because of the flood insurance rate maps. If you're seaward of the coastal construction control line, that's typically set by the Department of Environmental Protection. They give you an elevation, and that's where you have to start. The intent is to start that measurement wherever an individual who is constructing a building can obtain a building permit, the lowest point from which they can obtain a building permit.
Will that language be put in the regulation, in the regulation itself?
No, because it's tied to the ability to obtain a building permit. So if you cannot obtain a building permit for an elevation of a building you're proposing, we would not start your height measurement there.
I understand that. Okay, I'm just saying is, but what happens is, as you mentioned, some terms become very loosely interpreted, and as time goes on, so if there's some regulation that that the building permits refer to, that would be very helpful as far as definitions go.
Okay, we can certainly take a look at that. I appreciate your input.
Okay, I actually have one last question if no one else has a. Mine's kind of a housekeeping one. In the most recent send out that you have on Matt Lachey overlay, you mentioned in there that you're still keeping the not exceeding the 21 feet when it comes to maximum vertical plane, but on your descriptions, your photo showing your example does not show it's there. Is it remaining, or is it?
It is remaining. What I was showing, the mock-ups that I was showing are just for illustrative purposes only, just to show how height would be measured. It's not necessarily reflective of other regulations that are in the code and are currently in effect.
Is there a reason why Matt Lachey gets to remain in their little safety space?
That's a housekeeping issue that we're going to have to rectify. That was an error.
Well, I was going to say, well, you can put Pine Island back in there, and then there's not going to be a problem. Okay, so anybody else have any questions, comments, or concerns? Now is your time.
So when you're measuring from the lowest habitable spot, then you go up from there 38 feet?
33 feet.
So if the lowest habitable spot is 10 feet below the ground, you go up an additional 38 feet.
33. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Sure. So this is in the middle of a public outreach exercise that county staff is conducting on behalf of the board as directed by the Board of County Commissioners. The public hearing on these amendments and whether or not they are adopted in some current form is September 5th, 2023. The week preceding that, on August, I'm going forward, not backward, oh my gosh, August 29th, there is a Board of County Commissioners workshop, and I think the way that's probably going to be structured is we're going to present to the board, we conducted a series of meetings, here's the input we heard. We'd like to get some direction at some point, either that day or the following week, on how to proceed with the amendments if the board seeks to have any changes made based on that public input. You're welcome.
Okay. Well, can anybody reach out to you and send you an email if they have any additional questions?
Of course.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, and any other questions? Oh, please come.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. So the resiliency cushion, which is another section of this ordinance, applies specifically to flood hazard areas that are subject to wave action. So your coastal A zones and your velocity zones, if you're looking at a flood insurance rate map, purple and red.
I happen to have those out on the lobby in a stand thing.
Awesome. They're also on the county website.
Yes.
So if you have a property that's in one of those zones, you can put a good amount of Pine Island, and I believe almost all of Mount Lachey might be as well. You can essentially exceed your maximum or your lowest floor elevation by a maximum of 4 feet, and you can obtain a corresponding exceedance of height by 4 feet. It's very difficult to explain, but it makes sense in my head. Measured from the ground to the midpoint. No.
Okay, going once, going twice. All right, well, I would like to thank you, Anthony, for coming and listening to us. And hopefully you will be able to take some of our information back and improve the codes a bit more.
Thanks for having us. I am available for any questions via email, phone call. My contact information is on the county website, so please feel free to reach out if something keeps you up at night or wakes you up in the middle of the night. Don't hesitate.
Commissioner Ruane, do you have anything you need to add tonight?
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to us. As Anthony had indicated, we're having a public meeting August 9th, we're having a workshop on the 29th, and then the Board of County Commissioners on September 5th. So we have an opportunity to get whatever input you have. Feel free to contact me at district1@legalgov.com. Any issues you have, we'll certainly direct them to staff. This is part of the public outreach, so we want to make sure you're engaged in this process. The intent initially was to try to help you with resiliency, was to try to protect you from flood and have us not go through this process again. That was the intent behind this. We want to make sure we achieve that objective. So, but I appreciate your time tonight. I'll be around after if you need to have any questions. Thank you.
Okay. And if anybody needs Commissioner Ruane's email address, it is in the back in the lobby, along with all the additional commissioners that represent Lee County. And we have just another slide that actually has most of the, there we go. This slide has the development code attachments, links to it, and for Mount Lachey and Pine Island. And also, I remind you to write all your commissioners. And of course, our one commissioner that does represent us has the most purview to us. We thank him for coming. And Lastly, there's also going to be a hurricane recovery group that's going to be meeting on August 24th at Pine Island Elementary. They're going to be going over the the disaster recovery funds, the block grant, and how it's going to affect the different areas. The county was allotted 1.1 ... and a whole bunch of others billion, and that covers all of Lee County. So we do want to see what they're going to be able to help us with on Pine Island to our resiliency and our building back. All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn? No. Yes. At some point we will revisit that, unfortunately, because of Ian at his Okay. For those online that couldn't hear, we're talking about the incorporation of Pine Island. There's something that we were going to discuss as a group prior to Ian. There is quite a bit of discussion to have with it, but it's not just, unfortunately, put the paperwork in. Okay, so that is for a completely different meeting. Right now we are working and focused on recovery of Pine Island. Well, let's see what the rest of the hurricane season throws at us, or not. So it really all depends on what's on our schedule. At this point, I cannot set a date or a time for that to occur. Hopefully, we'll also have a lot of our residents, our part-time residents back. So even right now, we don't have the full island residents here to have a full and complete discussion. Yes, sir? Yeah, folks on online can't hear. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Charles Messina here. I live on the island, been here for a while, about 20 years. And I'm very concerned about the incorporation. And I don't want to put it off any longer, quite frankly. And I'm looking towards this group to do something about it. And it's not. And that's really frustrating me. And I just want you to know that, because I think it is this group that should take the bull by the horns and start doing something. And we have hurricanes every year. Doesn't matter, because they're eating our lunch out there, creeping up, annexing. And if we don't get our own representative that we finance from here on the island, and send them to the state to usher through that mission to incorporate, we need to finance that candidate. We need to get that underway. We need to get in touch with all the respected business owners on this island for contributions, because we need to fund that candidate. If we want our incorporation, that's what we need to do. There's a template. It's already been done not too long ago down in, I think, the village of Estero, okay? Mm-hmm. And they had Ray Rodriguez usher through the issue. And we need to create a board, and this is the organization that needs to do it and get the word out. And we need to stop dilly-dallying, because they're on our doorstep now. And if we're not going to be in control of development on this island, who do you want to have in control of development on this island? That's my question. So let's get on it, please.
I will definitely take your information, and I will be bringing it to my board, I promise. Anything else? All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Thank you. All approved? Any nays? No. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys coming. Our next meeting will be, excuse me, September 5th. Please mark your calendars. We will be here.